So Marvel just recently expanded on the spider sense of Peter Parker and honestly introduced this whole new side of his life that we never knew about before. This is quite literally the biggest change to Spider-Man in years. And I'm kind of amazed nobody's talking about it. So let's talk about his spider sense first, right? The thing with his spider sense is really, really cool. So the expansion of his spider sense actually comes by way of him training with Daredevil. Now, there are different reasons for why he's doing this, but when it comes to Peter Parker training with other superheroes, this isn't new, right? Peter Parker's done that consistently over the years in Marvel Comics. For example, he trained with Shang-Chi for a period of time and developed his own martial arts style called the Way of the Spider. And it was amazing. But I don't think that Marvel has actually referenced that in any meaningful way in recent years. But for his training with Daredevil, this is just due to the fact that Peter Parker met a new villain that beat the hell out of him. So he's just going to have to become stronger in order to be able to overcome this guy. As far as the spider sense goes, this is cool. So what happens is that in his training session with Daredevil basically turns 3 flashlights on directed at Peter Parker and says, I want you to dodge the beam. And so Peter Parker's like, look, my spider sense doesn't really work that way. And when Daredevil asks him, wait, so like with these flashlights on you, nothing's happening with your sense. And the response of Peter is, no, that's not how it functions, right? The spider sense is a response to danger. So if you started shooting at me, right, if you loaded a gun and pointed it at me, my spider sense would kick off. But in terms of just shining flashlights at me, no, that's not how my spider sense works. And so the process continues, because when that happens, laser beams start firing off at Peter. Right? Now, it is technically Matt Murdock using some weaponry left behind by Punisher that he just kind of picks up occasionally and then dismantles, destroys, whatever, but it's being repurposed for this whole training session. Now, the funny thing about this is that as the two of them are going at it, Matt Murdock kind of talks to himself for a minute and talks about how when he lost his eyesight and his world expanded, that he started shutting everything out. And that's kind of what Daredevil does, right? Because of his enhanced senses, he's able to pick up on heartbeat changes and different things like that. A lot of you guys know that. That's where this whole great big test of Peter comes from, because this whole fight that's going on between the two of them, it's really ceremonial more than anything else. That's not the ultimate goal of Matt Murdock. And that's one of the things that happens is that once they're done, he says every heartbeat, exhale, siren, touch, smell, woof, the smells, right? I invited all of it in. It was a trip, but eventually my body and mind found equilibrium, the ability to listen to everything and then in hearing everything around me, being able to figure out what's actually worth listening to. But one of the things that Peter says is in response to this, he doesn't really suppress his spider sense. Right? And that's where Daredevil's like, clearly you don't, right? If you had been suppressing your spider sense, then I would have been mopping you into a bucket because you would have been killed by laser beams. But that's where the bigger conversation comes into play. Because while Daredevil just asks, right, what's the whole point behind this training? Is it just you pushing your limits? Peter doesn't go into the whole conversation about Hellgate beating the hell out of him, but he just simply says there's room for improvement here. And so that's when Matt says that was the goal of the flashlight. The flashlight was, of course, not a credible threat. It was me testing you, right? That when I put the flashlight on you, I told you that I was going to turn the flashlight on. And then in that moment, your simus spinalis, right, the muscle in the back of your neck, basically kicked on. It literally tightened up. And he says, I heard that muscle tighten as soon as I flipped the flashlight on. So you knew the light was coming, even though you knew that it wouldn't hurt you. But the thing is that Peter says, well, my spider sense didn't really tingle because seemingly it wasn't a credible threat. And that's when Daredevil says, correct, you knew, but you didn't know that you knew. And so he says, as the resident expert on heightened senses, that says to me, some part of you is limiting your spider sense. And so Peter asks a question, like, can I expand on it? And Daredevil's just like, yeah, but it's also equilibrium. Now, what does all this mean? Okay, what Marvel's basically establishing here is that Peter's mind and body are quite literally disconnected, that his spider sense is a result of the sense itself picking up on danger, but specifically his body reacts to danger before the spider sense detects it. And so what's really being established here is that once Peter is able to find this equilibrium between his mind and his body, where his spinalis tensed up before his spider sense kicked on, and in fact, his spider sense didn't kick on at all, once Peter can bridge that gap, then he'll have this kind of perfect spider sense where his body and mind working in unison can react to things much, much faster than they traditionally would. Now, what role that's going to play in the future of Peter, I'm not entirely sure. But one of the things that I want to specify here, this is not the first time that Marvel has offered some expansion to the abilities of Peter in arguing that for whatever reason, he's basically limited himself in some capacity. The best example of that is a storyline called The Other, which is actually one of the comics being used to create Spider-Man Brand New Day. Within this story, Spider-Man had died and basically gone into this kind of cocoon form in order to recover. So I guess he wasn't really dead. But what matters is that he ends up meeting with this gigantic sentient spider, which reveals the true nature of Peter. That number one, he's a totem. He's tapped into a much larger source of power, that it wasn't something as simple as a radioactive spider bite. But more so than that, when it came to his use of his powers, that he just kind of treated it the way that a child would and interpreted it the way that a child would, meaning that he got the proportional strength of a spider. He could walk on walls or climb up walls. And of course he got a spider sense, but there was a lot more to his powers than he originally thought. It's just for some reason, he didn't let himself explore that train of thought. And so once Peter emerged from the cocoon, he had new abilities, right? He already had the existing power of shooting organic webbing, but then he got things like night vision and so on and so forth. Now, a lot of those elements just kind of went away over the years, but what you saw in The Other and what you're seeing here is one of the reasons why a lot of people look at Spider-Man and Marvel Comics in general and say that all Marvel really does is just take old plot threads, rehash them, give them a different package, and put them back out there again. So they're never really creating anything new, except for what they're getting ready to do here in a second, which is kind of nuts. But regardless of how you view the criticism, we actually get to see the full effect of Peter Parker's new spider sense and how it copes with the world around him, even if only momentarily, when he ends up coming across a guy by the name of Brian. Now, Brian is a guy who was working alongside Peter in conducting a experiment on Mysoteria. What ended up happening is the whole thing was sabotaged. Brian thinks Peter was the one who did it. And so Brian himself was infected with spores, and that's what he started calling himself, Spore. And so there's a few different caveats to what he can do now, but one of the most notable things is he now has the power of mind control. So he's not really that dissimilar from the Purple Man Zebediah Killgrave. He's just less powerful. And so when Peter gets an invitation from Dr. Osmani Milton, who's essentially his boss, and Peter arrives at the place where Dr. Milton told him to show up to, it doesn't seem right? It's just like this, Whimsy's Wonderland pizza adventure place, which seems a little weird given how serious Dr. Milton is, that he's met by Brian. And it turns out that what Brian has done was basically grab the entirety of the staff and using his mind control, essentially tormenting them, right? Forcing them to dance and, worship and all kinds of crazy stuff. But his whole motivation in being here is to find out why it was that Peter had torpedoed his entire experiment. And the funny thing is that because Peter's caught off guard by Brian having abilities, which Peter wasn't aware of anymore, and because Peter is hit by these spores of Brian, that Brian immediately asks him, why did you sabotage the Mysoteria experiment? And Peter, just immediately overtaken, says, it wasn't me. That was Ben Reilly, my clone. Now, a little bit of an explanation here, which I promise is pretty simple. The idea was that when Peter went off-world and basically formed his own Guardians of the Galaxy, for lack of a better word, because somebody had to operate back on Earth pretending to be Peter Parker so that none of his co-workers would think that he was gone, his clone Ben Reilly was asked to do that instead. Ben Reilly, though, over the deck, ended up sabotaging the experiment of Brian. And so when Peter says, my clone was the one who did it, he's right? He's accurate in that statement. But for someone like Brian, and just in general, the idea of the clone seems so incredibly ridiculous that Brian just refuses to believe it. He's like, okay, that's the dumbest excuse that I've ever heard in my life. And truth to tell, the fact that the whole clone thing is still hanging around after all these years is a little wonky. Marvel, do something with Ben other than him being pissy about the fact that, quote unquote, Peter stole his life. I am so tired of seeing that in Marvel Comics, Jesus, right? But the fact is, Peter is just caught off guard by all of this. And so being bombarded by all these spores, all the music blasting, watching his coworkers and his bosses being made to dance in this just kind of like twisted, sadistic manner, it's exactly the kind of situation that was being presented to him when he was training with Daredevil. Right? That's exactly what it was. And honestly, it just kind of feels like a fever dream, to be quite frank. It's nuts. But again, it's Brian trying to understand what's going on here. He knows that Peter has answers, and for him, it just seems far more personal, right? That for whatever reason, Peter hates him or something like that. Brian needs a personal answer to the question that he's asking Peter. And this is one of those situations where he's convinced himself of a particular answer, and every answer he gets will be wrong until he gets the answer that he he wants to hear. That's kind of the irony of it all, right? Choosing a neat lie over a messy truth. But at the end of the day, Peter does the only thing he can do. In this anger and in this moment, he just punches Brian as hard as he can. And then he feels guilty about it, because one of the things to remember is that Peter pulls his punches. Peter, when it comes to most people out there, never punches as hard as he possibly could. That was something that we learned when Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter. He literally punches Scorpion and knocks his jaw off his face. And that's when Dr. Octopus is like, holy shit, like Peter's been pulling his punches. This dude could have beat us to death at any moment. Right? But he says the punch that he delivers, because it's done in an act of desperation, is a punch that he would actually reserve for someone like the Juggernaut. But because of the fact that Brian is infected by the spore, his body isn't really human anymore, right? It's just one part spore and one part Brian. His mind is there, but the physical form of his body is not. So he literally starts reconstituting himself. That's kind of the craziness behind it all. And so in the midst of all this chaos and all this pandemonium, Kensuji shows up. Now, Kensuji's not a great big huge character. He's basically this Spider-Man fanboy who just keeps showing up in the comics arbitrarily because he wants to be Peter's sidekick. And Peter gives him words of encouragement, but for the most part is like, no, right? You are not going to be my sidekick. I don't do sidekicks, right? But eventually that's going to happen. Kensuji is going to end up becoming the sidekick of Peter. But his arrival here is fortuitous because Kensuji basically has a mask on his face, which protects him from the spores. And so while he's certainly not powerful enough to be able to beat someone like Brian, the fact is he can offer a distraction, which is just enough for Peter to be able to focus on himself. That while Kensuji's dealing with Brian, Brian's not attacking Peter. And so Peter starts to take the advice of Matt Murdock. Take everything in. Instead of trying to block things out consciously and figure out what's important and what's not important and so on and so forth, inhale everything. And only in doing that are you going to be able to effectively filter out what's important and what's not. But the other reason why it matters is because it will allow your body to be able to process what's happening to it. And in that moment, allow your body to adapt and overcome. And building this equilibrium between your spider sense and your body, it'll allow your spider sense to be able to overcome this threat as well. So it's basically taking the flu shot right at the beginning of flu season so your body can adapt to it and then overcome it once the flu arrives. And that's exactly what happens. It's a brief moment. It's very, very, very small. Spider-Man starts fighting at this hyper level, like immediately overtakes Brian almost in the blink of an eye. It looks like he moves faster. It looks like he punches harder. It looks like his spider sense is less an expansion of an early detection of what's going on with him. And it just looks like it heightens his abilities to a new level, stronger, faster, more durable, that kind of thing, to the point that he actually beats Brian to pieces and Brian has to retreat in order to reconstitute himself. Now, this is one of those stories that we in the comic book scene refer to as a branching story. Brian is just what allows the story to happen. That's it. The main meat and potatoes of this is that now Peter has a heightened set of abilities, and this all goes towards him facing off against Hellgate. And so I simply say that to say, for everything going on with Brian in this story, it might as well have just been Peter and the Incredible Hulk in an arm wrestling contest, and that Peter discovers a whole new level of strength and like beating the Hulk in arm wrestling, and like now he's ready to fight Hellgate. That's the only real value that you're getting out of here, right? Just a set of events that happen that allow for the result of that event to benefit Peter. Here's where the whole life-changing thing comes into play. That what ends up happening is that when Peter gets back home with Aunt May and her friend, that what happens is a guy by the name of Mac shows up. Technically his name is Cormac Crane, but Mac is what everybody calls him. But here's the important thing. This is not the first time that he has met Aunt May or Peter. That honestly, it all starts with Peter himself. That during the whole Death Spiral storyline, when he ends up meeting Torment, right, a villain that has the ability to detect the genetic connections between people, that there was reference made to this guy who was saved by Peter, a guy named Mac, was Peter's cousin. And Peter didn't know about it. So Peter was kind of like, okay, cool, right, this guy's my cousin, like, we'll trace that plot thread at some point. But for Cormac, there had to be more to it than that. He couldn't just be the cousin of Peter Parker. There had to be something more significant. So he ends up tracing down this lineage, and then he ends up going to meet Aunt May at the Feast Volunteer Institute, which had basically just been torn apart in the fight at the conclusion of Death Spiral. And so in meeting her, one of the things that she noticed right off the bat is he looks exactly like Uncle Ben. Now, she kind of dismissed it. She was like, oh, it's whatever. It's whatever. He looks so much like Uncle Ben. And so what ends up happening is when he shows up here, he presents a piece of paper and he gives it to Aunt May and then tells her, Maybelle Parker is my mother. I am your son, Aunt May. And that's the crazy thing, is because what happens following this is, of course, she passes out. But before she does, she says, I knew it had to be true. From the moment that I saw you, I knew that it had to be true. So how do you square this circle, right? What happened that Aunt May and Uncle Ben had a kid that seemingly Peter never knew about, just some cousin out there somewhere that he was blissfully unaware of? Well, the way it played out was like this. Aunt May tells this story that's beautiful and tragic at the same time. And to be honest, I love this expansion that Marvel's doing here, right? What she says is that there was a point where she was told that her and Ben couldn't have any kids together, right? That just wasn't going to happen. It just wasn't a possibility. And so she says that they didn't want children at first, that Ben had seen the world in the army and that he wanted to share that with her, that children would only really slow them down. And so she kind of talks about how it was really silly in retrospect, considering the fact that they were so broke. Where were they going to travel to, right? What were they going to see? But that's kind of benefit, right? Having kids takes away that option for the most part. Not having them leaves the option open should the opportunity ever arrive. And so that's when she says, despite how dismissive we were about it, we got pregnant immediately, right? And she says, just after the first trimester, I miscarried, right? She says, I have a heart condition and they told me that I could not safely bear children. And she says, the irony that my heart was keeping me from loving a child was not lost on me. And frankly, it pissed me off. So despite the doctor's orders and Ben's good sense, we kept trying. I only ever saw Ben nervous a handful of times. Whenever we would go in for another rabbit test, he would practically shake. That he was right to be scared. The second pregnancy ended just after a few weeks. Cramps, some spotting, and that was it. The third time was the charm, the bad luck charm. I was in the hospital for 2 months and still lost the baby. After the doctor explained the damage that I'd done to my body in gruesome mansplaining detail, he finally left us alone to stew in fear and guilt. Ben fixed me with a look and simply asked, are we going to accept the hand that we've been dealt, or do you want to die? Now, here's an important thing to understand here, and I think that Joe Kelly kind of touches on it, but honestly, I think this should have been expanded more. One of the things, as I understand it, not being a woman, I can't necessarily speak to it, but one of the things that I understand for a lot of women who are trying to have a kid and are unsuccessful in doing so, it's devastating. And one of the biggest reasons why, as I understand it, is that I think a lot of women see producing a child as the most basic action that a woman can engage in. It's the one thing that all of humanity has been doing since the dawn of modern man, to the point that some people can't stop having kids, even though they know they shouldn't. And it seems that for a lot of women out there, being unable to do that flies in the face of what they consider to be an action that a woman is supposed to engage in. Now, whether or not it's right or wrong is irrelevant. It's simply just a feeling that, from what I gather, a lot of women experience. I think that focusing on that a little bit more in the comic would have been cool, but be that as it may, Aunt May's response here is that there are moments when you're with someone that you love, right? Crossroad moments, that you can see it in their eyes, that the words you say next will determine the course of your relationship. And so she says, I chose acceptance. We moved on, started living with what we had instead of what we didn't. A year later, we even took a trip to Europe that we couldn't afford. The first time out of the country, not counting the Canadian side of the Niagara Falls, because that never counts. And so she says, we went to Ireland. I don't know if people do it anymore because they're so afraid of germs, but in Blarney, they would hang you upside down at this castle and you could kiss a slab of marble. It's supposed to give the gift of gab, but some woman on the tour bus put it in my head that it gave you a wish. I was probably a little tipsy. We were tipsy a lot during that trip, and as the blood rushed to my head, my wish popped into my head. Give Ben a son. And so she says, a few months later, I was showing. A few months after that, I was huge. The doctors were so scared that I would drop dead that they put me in bed for the whole trimester. Every day, Ben would tend to me, make me meals, give me vitamins, and massage my legs, and rub my back and whisper, "Those tricky damn leprechauns," which is one of the most adorable things that I think I've ever heard. And she says sometimes he'd cry when he said it, and I would pretend that I didn't notice. He was smiling, and so she says, my water broke on my due date while I was in the shower, not even born yet, and the baby was quite considerate. The delivery went like clockwork. It was a miracle. I saw my baby once, a boy. He was perfect, but he didn't cry. And I remember realizing that I'd waited my whole adult life to hear my newborn baby cry. A minute passed, and then 3. Someone said respiratory distress, and then neonatal unit, and they rushed him out of there. Ben held me, and we lied to one another that everything would be fine. Eventually, the doctor returned, and it wasn't fine. I don't remember much after that day. And so she goes on to explain that Ben took care of everything, right? The paperwork, the burial, the whole 9 yards. And for a long time, Aunt May was struggling with depression in the face of all of this, which makes perfect sense. Losing a child is something that some men and women never recover from. It can destroy marriages, it can destroy people, right? It can break a human being on the most fundamental level. But for Aunt May, there simply came a point when she just jumped out of bed one day and started making breakfast. And she talks about how it scared the hell out of Uncle Ben, right? They're like, one day his wife is just struggling with depression in the worst way. And the next day she's just making breakfast, right? It freaked him out. He was terrified. But the statement she made was that I am not going to let this dominate my life anymore. And neither are you. The reality is that we tried 4 times, in fact, and on the whole, we've been unsuccessful. So it's simply just accepting having children is not for us. And they moved forward from there. And so what she ends up doing is taking this piece of paper out of a picture, and she says it became the thing that we would never speak about, not to one another and not to anyone else. It wasn't the healthy way to deal with it, but it is what we did. And so she tells Peter, right, when you came into our lives, raising you was the greatest job that either of us had, myself, your Uncle Ben. We loved you as much as we would love any child of my own. And she says, I'm sorry I didn't tell you any of this, Peter. And so when she hands Mac the document, it's a birth certificate. And at that point, Aunt May goes into her room, and Peter's just kind of standing over the table, looking at Mac as he goes over this birth certificate, reveals that his birthday is the exact same day, and that he seemingly truly is the son of Aunt May, which begs the question, 1, what happened to him? And number 2, what does Peter do now knowing that there is a whole part of his life that he never knew about? So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.